Hi, everybody. And here we are. Hey, we're live. Hi, everyone. Emil Guillermo here. We are. We got to switch the lights. I'm actually in my closet, and we do this live because we can. We can, and I'm doing this because if you know, Saturday is Halloween, and on Halloween we're going to have this at 1 o'clock Pacific time. We're going to have this special discussion. There's this movie out called the Celine Archive. The professor of film at San Francisco State, Celine Shimizu, has done this documentary, and it's a pretty interesting documentary if you want to know the story of Celine Navarro. Now, Celine Navarro was murdered in 1932. And her murder, when I first heard this story, I thought, my God, this is a fascinating story. She was buried alive. And her alleged perps were put on trial. They were indicted and put on trial. And in 1933, they were acquitted. End of story. You never heard this story again. Every now and then you hear it in, some Philippine history buff mention it, Filipino American history buff mention it. Alex Fabris wrote a piece about it in the 90s. Dawn Mabalan had it in her book, Little Manila's in the Heart. And now there's a documentary. Not necessarily about the entire case, but it talks about the case. It brings it forward for the family, the Navarro family. And it's an especially emotional and touching film for the director, Professor Shimizu, San Francisco State. The movie's getting some good reviews around the country as it goes from film festival to film festival, even under COVID. And I've seen the movie. It's very emotional, but it's worth talking about because in this movie, there are a couple things going on. It's a movie about a woman, a Filipino woman in the 1930s. When do you hear about that? It's a woman who was murdered, and there's a social justice thing happening here. And then it brings it forward. Why haven't we heard about this movie? This story. This story has been a common, almost ghost story among people who lived in the Central Valley, Filipinos. They've told this part of the story or the whole story in the community. People have heard it as young kids about, woman buried alive in the Central Valley, on Jersey Island, in the Delta region near Stockton. And now, it seems appropriate that to understand the full story, to get an understanding of what happened, we have this discussion that we're holding online on Saturday at 1 p.m. So go to the link below and sign up for the webinar. It's going to be interesting. We have Professor Shimizu, her sister, who's also a producer and also a professor at USC. We have relatives of the Navarro family who will be with us. And we have Dorothy Cordova of the Filipino American National Historical Society Executive Director. This is going to be a nice event. I'm going to be moderating it. We're going to have a conversation about the film, the story, the history. Some things you must consider. This is a story that has stayed in Stockton Although in 1933, it was worldwide. The New York Times ran stories about this. There are stories about it in all throughout internationally. It was seen as a cultist murder, sort of like Charlie Manson or that kind of thing. It was that kind of sensationalistic murder that was covered in that way. And because there were Filipinos, there was these little jabs at the Filipino community. The Stockton Record called it jungle justice. Why was it jungle justice? It was jungle justice because the story goes Cecilia Navarro was part of an offshoot of the Caballeros de Masalang, CDA. And they had a women's organization, a women's auxiliary called the Maria Clara Lodge. This was a way that Filipinos were able to exist in society, to have these fraternal organizations that allowed them to have a Philippines in America, to have allowed them to have a Philippines cultural society right here, so they felt at home in this home away from home, which is ironic because this was their home. They were American nationals. They came to America as an American nationals. 1933, that was their status. And yet in 1933, there was also this anti-Filipino sentiment that had been raging since the late 1920s, 1930. There were riots in Watsonville. 1929, there were riots in Exeter, which is down south of Stockton. 1930, they had a bombing in Stockton. This is serious stuff here. The anti-Filipino fervor that was there because Filipinos were seen as taking jobs and seen as taking women. And this may be the interesting part of the story because Cecilia Navarro was a woman, one of the few Filipino women allowed to come to America. Remember, 40,000 Filipinos in 1930, 7% women. Talk about those odds. And you're a Filipino male looking for a woman to start a family. There was power being a Filipino woman. And yet you don't hear their stories. Their control over the men and the jealousy among the men. And certainly all of these things come out in the Cecilia Navarro story. Cecilia Navarro witnesses a crime committed against a white woman who was being attacked. She was going out with a Filipino guy who was a member of the CDA. Cecilia Navarro's testimony helped put away those CDA members. To San Quentin, they went to San Quentin. For violating the secrecy, she was kidnapped. I guess that's not too strong a word. She was taken, she was beaten. But later on, she appears to have been kidnapped again after she was first released. This is by the fraternal organization. And she was accused of adultery. And by this fraternal organization. This was a court. Hence, you had people describing this in the mainstream papers as jungle justice. You had this sensationalized as a cult murder. What happened to Cecilia? She was punished. She was beaten, allegedly, and she was sentenced to die. 1932. They took her body to Jersey Island. They buried her. Later on, a member of the CDA went to the authorities. They dug up the body. She did not die of the beating. She died of suffocation. Hence, buried alive. and then the trial in 1933, and the story's forgotten. Because ultimately, we didn't want to know the story. Filipinos didn't want this negative story heard. But it's our history. It's the history of the Filipinos in America, right when the most Filipinos since the arrival to America because of the colonial era, right there in Stockton, 40,000 in America, and Stockton was the hub. All this information I took from Professor Don Mabalin, the late Don Mabalin's Little Manila's in the Heart. Those are the facts. Those will be the facts that we operate from when we talk about the film, the Celine Archive. So if you now know about the story, come talk about it with us. The discussion's free. The webinar invite is on this post. Come see it, and you can participate, ask questions. We'll have the director there. She'll talk about it. We'll have family members there to talk about it. And we'll have Dorothy Cordova, who is the founder, co-founder with her husband of the Filipino American National Historical Society. She also, I mean, the FANHS is the reason why we have Filipino American History Month, October 31st, last day of History Month. And it's appropriate that we cap it off with a discussion about this story, which is now getting some attention because of this new film. So we'll talk about the new film. We'll talk about the documentary. We'll talk about the facts and the story itself. And maybe it'll give us an historical sense about the importance of this story, what it tells us about how our Philippine American society evolved. Certainly we know from this story how it impacted someone like Professor Celine Shimizu. She had suffered a tragic loss, and in looking at the tragic loss of the Navarro family, she found some closure for herself. She brought history forward, history to the present, and enabled it to give her some closure. So there's some interesting stories here to talk about. I hope this conversation or this monologue has helped you to be interested in this bit of history, a bit of history that we rarely see discussed in Filipino American history classes. I remember when I first heard it, I just was kind of shocked by it. You know, Alex Fabros told me about it. This was after he wrote it, years after he did. I said, Alex, he shared some of his archive with me, shared the headlines. I said, wow, this really happened, huh? And you go and look at the newspaper clippings that Alex has collected. Pretty amazing how they viewed Filipinos. And you have to think that it didn't help the Filipinos when the politics was turning against them in the Congress, which passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which repatriated Filipinos in 1934. So, a history lesson. Come discuss, come hear people talk about this story and what it means to us. That's coming up October 31st, Halloween, a real life ghost story. We uncover the story, we talk about it. The film director also, if you go to the webinar link, you can get a link to where you can see the film. I don't think it's free, but you can see the film before you talk about it. And so I hope you take part, sign up, register. It's free. We'll see you on the webinar. I thought I'd do a Facebook Live here just to let you know that it's a good community story, important not just for the Stockton area, but for Filipino Americans everywhere. to see just what it was like for Filipino Americans in the 1930s and how they saw the weird social things happening when you have such skewed ratios of men to women and the amount of sexual jealousy, the tension. Imagine what it was like to be Filipino in America in the 1930s. That's what the story means to me. Anyway, check it out. You can always email me at Filipino museum@gmail.com, Filipino museum@gmail.com. Hope you sign up for the webinar. It's the link on this post. I will look forward to, we won't have our regular pop-up on Saturday because this event is at 1 o'clock Pacific on Saturday. And we might have a pop-up on Sunday, but the museum is trying to work to be open. San Joaquin County has dropped from purple to red. So far, the green lights are on, even though the numbers for COVID aren't necessarily the greatest nationwide. But we're looking to open. But until then, we have our virtual sessions. Check it out. Saturday, 1 o'clock Pacific. The webinar links below. I'm Emil Guillermo. Hey, thanks for joining me here on this little mini pop-up. We'll talk to you again soon. Mahals and salams.